Just the night shift again. That's what charge nurse Rodriguez said when Megan O'Brien accepted the assignment nobody else wanted. Room 347. Commander Hayes. 5 years comatose. The words came out casual, relieved, like someone had finally answered a prayer she'd stopped praying. Rodriguez didn't look up from the scheduling tablet. She never did. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the nursing station, casting everything in that pale institutional white that made 2 a.m. feel permanent. Megan nodded. Ask nothing. Her scrubs were still crisp from the package, wrinkles pressed out that morning in her apartment across town. She'd chosen the pale blue ones deliberately. They didn't stand out. Nothing about her was supposed to stand out. Just another per diem nurse filling shifts, picking up the unwanted rotations, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. Cedar Creek Medical's long-term care unit didn't need another memorable face. It needed bodies with licenses and liability insurance. The facility smelled the way every long-term care unit smelled, antiseptic layered over something underneath that nobody wanted to name. Bleach and resignation. Ventilators hissing their mechanical rhythms behind closed doors. The place had been built in 1987 and updated once in 2003. You could feel the age in how the linoleum didn't quite reach the baseboards, in how the overhead fixtures buzzed with the particular fury of ballasts dying slow deaths. Megan walked past the rows of rooms, her left leg carrying weight slightly more carefully than her right. The limp was real enough, a gift from Sanjin Valley, compliments of a Taliban IED detonated 3.2 seconds before her convoy cleared the blast radius. Some days it barely registered. Tonight, it registered. Room 347 was at the end of the corridor, past the supply closet and the bathroom that always smelled like someone had been sick. The door was halfway open. She pushed it wider with her hip, her hands already reaching for the blood pressure cuff mounted on the wall. The room was dark except for the monitor's blue glow, vitals displayed in an endless loop, numbers that hadn't changed in 5 years. Commander James Hayes lay in the center of the hospital bed like something the room had swallowed and couldn't quite digest. Gray hair. Strong jaw softened by time and disuse. Ventilator tube secured at his mouth with tape that had been changed 1,000 times. His chest rose and fell with the metronomic precision of the machine breathing for him 14 times per minute, every time exactly like the last. The folded flag was on the bedside table. American flag, perfectly creased, sitting in the space between Hayes's useless right hand and the water pitcher nobody used anymore. Megan's breath caught. She didn't mean for it to. She steadied herself against the bed rail and looked away, scanning the monitors instead. Blood pressure 118/72. Oxygen saturation 96. Heart rate 58. All stable. All exactly as they should be for a man who'd been somewhere else for 60 months. She reached toward the flag, her hand moving on instinct, muscle memory pulling her toward that rectangle of cloth like it was magnetic. Her fingers were 3 inches from it when she pulled back. Tucked her hands into her scrub pockets. Straightened. Not yet. Not in the room. Not when the cameras covered every angle. Not when she still had to be just another compliant nurse, just another body filling the night shift, just another person nobody suspected of being anything more. The door opened without a knock. Dr. Pierce. He was tall, early 50s, the kind of man who moved through hospitals like he owned the deed. His white coat was tailored, actual tailoring, the kind that costs money, and he carried a tablet the way other men carried weapons. His eyes didn't move from the screen when he entered, which meant he was already dismissing her before they made contact. Megan had seen it 1,000 times. The calculation that happened in 3 seconds flat. Woman. Nurse. Night shift. New. Not important. You're the new night nurse, he said. Not a question. His voice had the particular timbre of someone accustomed to being right about everything, particularly things he didn't bother to verify. He finally looked at her. Looked through her, more accurately. His gaze landed somewhere in the vicinity of her shoulder. Yes, doctor, Megan said. Her voice came out soft. Deferential. The kind of voice that apologized for existing. She'd practiced it for 3 weeks in the bathroom mirror until it felt natural. Until it became the voice of someone who'd never kicked in a compound door in Marja. Someone who'd never called in danger close over a radio that crackled with static and fear. Commander Hayes requires minimal intervention, Pierce continued, scrolling through something on his tablet with one finger. Standing orders are in the chart. You follow them exactly. No deviations. No experiments. No bright ideas about what might help. He said the last part like it was a joke. Like the idea that a nurse might help was so fundamentally absurd it deserved mockery. He's been stable for 5 years. The goal is maintaining that stability, not pursuing fantasy outcomes. Am I clear? Very clear, Doctor. Megan kept her hands visible. Kept her posture small. The kind of small that doesn't challenge, doesn't question, doesn't possess any thought worth interrupting. Her jaw tightened though, she felt it happen, felt the muscles bunch at the hinge, and she covered it by turning to check the ventilator settings. The machine displayed everything in green. Everything was exactly as prescribed. Pierce was leaving already. He turned for the door, his attention already moving to the next thing, the next room, the next patient who also didn't matter to him. Megan waited until his footsteps receded down the corridor, waited until they were completely gone, waited until she heard the elevator doors open and close 20 rooms away. Only then did she look at the flag again. The thing about classified assignments was that nobody ever issued a classified assignment. There was no paperwork. No official orders. No documentation that would ever exist in any file system that someone like Dr. Pierce could subpoena or question or verify. Instead, there was a phone call from a number that probably didn't exist, routed through a Pentagon extension that was listed under a dead man's name, from a voice that identified itself only as control. There was a folder delivered to her apartment by someone who never knocked, never made eye contact, never said anything except Cedar Creek Medical. Night shift. Hayes in 347. You go in as civilian. You find out what's happening with his care. You find out what Dr. Marcus Pierce is billing Medicare for on comatose patients who can't possibly need what he's charging for. Megan had asked one question, how deep? The voice on the phone, male, older, the kind of calm that came from having given orders that resulted in consequences, had answered with, as deep as it takes. She'd been a captain in the Joint Special Operations Command's Medical Operations Division before they'd quietly retired her file and made her disappear into the civilian world. 23 years of service. 2 Purple Hearts. A Silver Star earned in Helmand Province for extracting 12 wounded from a position that was supposed to be impossible to extract from. 12 people had walked out of that valley because Megan had refused the option of leaving them behind. They'd given her a call sign after that, Valkyrie, after the Norse mythology, after the beings that determined who would live and who would die. She'd worn it like a scar, which was fitting, because she wore scars too. The one on her right shoulder where shrapnel had caught her. The one along her left ribs where a surgeon at Kandahar airfield had dug out a piece of an IED casing that had come within a millimeter of her heart. The surgical scars that wouldn't show under scrubs. Now she was Megan O'Brien, RN. Nothing in her personnel file suggested she'd ever worn anything but white shoes. No reference to JSOC. No mention of 3 tours in combat zones. No indication that she'd been in the room when they'd pulled Commander James Hayes out of a burning convoy near Helmand Province, that she'd kept him alive through a 2-hour medevac flight to Bagram, that he'd woken up briefly in the hospital in Germany and asked for his commander, her, and she'd been there beside his bed and squeezed his hand and told him he was going to make it. He'd believed her. He'd survived the initial injuries. The surgery had been successful. The follow-up recovery had been textbook. And then, 3 months later, he'd suffered a catastrophic stroke while in a rehabilitation facility in North Carolina, a stroke that came with no warning, a stroke that left him in the persistent vegetative state he'd occupied for 5 years since. Megan had read the official reports. She'd read them the way someone reads a lie they already know is a lie. A stroke in a 42-year-old Coast Guard officer with no family history of neurological disease. A stroke with no identifiable trigger. A stroke that had happened conveniently after Medicare had already approved 6 months of full inpatient rehabilitation and authorized whatever specialists Dr. Pierce deemed necessary. Control's voice on the phone: "We think he didn't have a stroke. We think Pierce induced it. We think Hayes is one of 7 comatose patients Pierce has hospitalized in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, all of whom are receiving continuous specialist consultations they never actually received. All of whom are generating between $47,000 and $89,000 per month in fraudulent billing. That's somewhere between $3 million and $5 million per patient over 5 years of hospitalization. That's a scheme worth somewhere between $15 and $25 million across all his patients. That's an amount of money that makes people very motivated to keep those patients exactly as they are. Alive but not recovering. Expensive but not expensive enough to trigger additional audits." That's when Megan had asked if she'd be working alone. Control had said yes. The night shift was quiet. That was the thing about long-term care: nothing happened at night. The patients didn't wake up. The families didn't visit. Dr. Pierce didn't appear. Megan worked through the darkness, checking vitals every 2 hours, changing bedding when necessary, ensuring the feeding tube maintained its position, watching the monitors for any sign of change. She was good at it. Competence was always her first language. She'd performed field triage in sandstorms. She'd kept people alive in circumstances that had no business allowing survival. A night shift routine at Cedar Creek Medical was so straightforward it almost felt like rest. Almost. At 3:08 a.m., she sat in the break room with coffee that tasted like the sludge at the bottom of a range barrel. The room was empty except for her. The vending machine hummed in the corner. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular kind of exhaustion that came with overnight work. Megan pulled out her phone, a clean phone, untraceable, the kind that Control had left in her apartment with a note that said "Report daily," and typed a message: "Position secured. Observation commenced. Hay stable. Pierce not present overnight." She hit send and watched the message disappear. Outside the break room windows, Atlanta stretched dark and wet. It had rained while she was working, the kind of November rain that came without warning and left the parking lot slicked with autumn leaves and standing water. Somewhere out there, a helicopter was probably landing at Dobbins Air Reserve Base. Somewhere out there, reports were being filed about her arrival, about her position, about her mission. And somewhere in the building, in an office she hadn't yet located, Dr. Pierce was billing Medicare for specialist consultations that never happened on patients who would never recover. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Megan could already feel the weight of 5 years of medical files in her hands. The worst part was that she was about to discover something far darker than fraud. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce had no idea who he was standing next to, and when he found out, it would be the last thing his career could survive. Morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical started like most others, Dr. Pierce's voice preceding him down the hallway, residents trailing like pilot fish behind a shark. Megan adjusted Commander Hayes's position, her hands working with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The folded flag sat on the bedside table, corners aligned perfectly. She didn't look up when the group entered. "Nurse O'Brien, what unauthorized protocol are you performing?" Pierce's voice cut across the room like a scalpel. She turned, movements controlled. "Repositioning per standard decubitus prevention, doctor." His smile arrived before his words. "I've reviewed the chart. Hourly neuro checks on a patient unresponsive for 5 years. That's waste. That's emotional attachment disguised as medicine." He stepped closer, close enough that she caught the coffee on his breath. "Which community college taught you that particular fantasy?" Jennifer Hayes, the commander's sister, sat rigid in the corner chair. Her hand covered her mouth. "The protocols come from," Megan began. "I don't care." Pierce turned to the residents, his voice taking on the theatrical quality of a man performing for an audience. "This is what happens when we lower standards. We get nurses who think they're healers instead of task workers. One resident laughed nervously. Another made a note in his chart. At Cedar Creek, we follow evidence. We don't coddle coma patients with hourly checks like they're conscious. We bill what we bill. We document what matters. Everything else is noise. Megan's jaw tightened, imperceptible to anyone not trained to read the micro-expressions of survival. Her left hand trembled once, a single second of weakness, before she stilled it against her thigh. Her voice came out level, a nurse's voice, obedient and small. "Yes, doctor." Pierce held her gaze for 3 more seconds, searching for crack, finding none. He turned back to the residents and led them out, his lecture continuing in the hallway about resource allocation and the dangers of sentimentality in medicine. Jennifer approached as soon as the door closed. "I'm so sorry, he had no right." Megan shook her head gently, already moving toward the vitals monitor. "It's fine, Mrs. Hayes. Let me get you some fresh water." Her voice was steady. Her movements were smooth. Her hands no longer shook. But inside her chest, something shifted, a realization settling like a stone. This wasn't random cruelty. This was calculated removal. He knew she was watching. He was eliminating her credibility before she could become a threat. The break room at 2 a.m. was fluorescent and humming, the vending machine's mechanical breath the only sound. Megan sat at the center table with her lunch, sandwich wrapped in plastic, red apple, thermos of black coffee. 3 night nurses sat nearby, mid-conversation about a difficult patient transfer. The moment Megan pulled out her chair, the conversation stopped. Without a word, all 3 stood, collected their food, and moved to the far table by the windows. One nurse glanced back with something like pity. Another whispered something that made the 3rd nurse laugh quietly, the sound like glass breaking in slow motion. Megan unwrapped her sandwich. She bit into it. She chewed. Her face showed nothing, not hurt, not anger, not isolation. Just neutral observation, the expression of someone reading data from a monitor. She ate methodically while the other nurses laughed at the far table, their voices carrying across the break room like they wanted her to hear. Halfway through, she threw the remaining half away. The apple followed. She poured the coffee down the sink and rinsed the thermos with mechanical precision. When she left the break room, she passed the bulletin board near the nurse's station. The written warning was posted at eye level, printed on official letterhead, laminated for permanence. Written warning, Megan O'Brien, RN. Infraction, failure to follow chain of command regarding unauthorized patient protocols. Supervisor, Dr. Cia Pierce. Date, today. Further violations may result in immediate termination. 20 staff members passed it during the shift change. Some read it openly, their eyes finding her afterward. Others glanced and looked away quickly, the way people avert their gaze from accident scenes. Sandra, the day shift charge nurse, touched Megan's shoulder near the time clock. "Honey, maybe you should request a transfer. Different unit, different supervisor." Megan clocked out, her hand steady inserting and withdrawing the card. "See you tomorrow, Sandra." She walked to her car in the pre-dawn darkness, the Atlanta air hanging thick and warm, the parking lot empty except for a delivery truck backing toward the emergency bay. Only when she sat in the driver's seat, alone, did her hands shake violently on the steering wheel. She gripped it until her knuckles turned white, her breathing coming in controlled counts, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, are the same technique they taught in survival training. Tactical breathing. Designed for soldiers facing down impossible odds. This was impossible odds. She pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and opened the photograph she'd taken of Commander Hayes' billing records. The pattern was unmistakable now. Monthly specialist consultations billed at $8,400 each. Infectious disease workups at $6,200. Advanced imaging studies at $12,100. But the consultation notes were template, generic, lacking the specificity that would indicate actual examinations had occurred. She'd cross-referenced them with the patient's chart, no new symptoms reported, No clinical changes, no medical interventions recorded that would warrant such consultations. 2 other long-term coma patients on the unit had identical billing patterns. 3 other patients. 12 months of fraudulent billing. She did the math in her head, the numbers adding up like a prosecutor's opening statement. $400,000. Maybe more. And she was the only one who'd noticed because she was the only one actually looking at Commander Hayes. The only one who saw him as something other than a billing code. The only one who understood what it meant that a man could lie in a bed for 5 years while his family waited and his treatments were manufactured on paper and his care was reduced to a revenue stream. Pierce knew she was looking. He was removing her before she could tell anyone what she'd found. She sat in her car as the sky began to lighten, the kind of pale blue that comes before dawn, and made a decision that changed everything. She would continue. She would visit Commander Hayes on her shifts. She would talk to him about Coast Guard operations and Helmand Province and the radio protocols he'd memorized 15 years ago. She would play the audio files of rescue operations and unit deployments. She would tell him about his teammates, about the families waiting for answers, about the folded flag on his bedside table that represented something that mattered more than Dr. Pierce's billing schemes or Cedar Creek Medical's quarterly earnings reports. She would prove, somehow, that one conscious nurse with nothing left to lose could matter more than one arrogant doctor with hundreds of thousands of reasons to bury the truth. The next night, Megan sat beside Commander Hayes's bed during the quiet hours, when the unit was empty except for the sound of ventilators and cardiac monitors. She played the Coast Guard radio chatter on her phone speaker, keeping the volume low. Real radio traffic. Real operations. Real men and women doing what she used to do, the impossible work, the invisible work, the work that kept other people safe. Your unit executed a rescue at sea 3 months ago, she told him quietly. 23 sailors off a fishing vessel. Your replacement as command led the operation. They all came home. She paused. Your family still asks about you, Commander. Your sister Jennifer comes every Saturday. She hasn't missed a visit in 5 years. She holds your hand and talks about the weather and your nephew's basketball games. She doesn't know why you're still here. She's waiting for you to wake up and tell her it was worth it. His monitors maintained their rhythm. Unchanged. Unresponding. But she continued anyway. My son serves in the Coast Guard now. Did you know that? He followed because of men like you. Because men like you did the impossible and lived to tell the story. He wanted to be that man. So I came here to make sure your story didn't disappear into billing codes and paperwork and doctors who see you as a line item instead of a human being. She reached over and straightened the folded flag, the fabric worn soft from years of handling, the creases permanent and precise. An honor flag. A symbol of something that transcended hospital protocols and Medicare fraud and career advancement. I'm running out of time, Commander. Dr. Pierce is removing me systematically. Another few weeks and I'll be gone. So I need you to wake up. I need you to come back because the truth only matters if someone who was there is alive to tell it. Her voice cracked once. Just once. She took a breath and composed herself, her hand steady as she adjusted his full line, her movements precise and clinical once more. The mask was back in place. The nurse was back. The captain remained hidden. But that night, she photographed 6 more billing records and made a decision that would either save Commander Hayes or destroy her career entirely. There was no middle ground anymore. No staying hidden. No quietly gathering evidence and hoping someone else would notice. The night shift had become her real work. The performance improvement plan was theater, bureaucracy for the file, but the hours between midnight and 6 were when Megan's actual mission breathed. She entered room 347 with the same quiet efficiency she'd used 10,000 times before, but everything had changed. The stakes had calcified. The mask was slipping. She pulled the chair close to Commander Hayes's bed, not far enough away to seem professional, not close enough to seem unprofessional. The monitors beat their steady rhythm, a mechanical metronome measuring a man's suspension between living and ceasing to exist. Megan had studied his file so thoroughly she could recite his service record backward: 23 years in the Coast Guard, 3 tours in the Helmand Province, 47 rescue operations, 2 instances of extraordinary valor that never made the official reports because the operations were classified. "You remember Sanjin Valley," she said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that it wouldn't carry into the hallway where the night nurses charted. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines held that position for 47 days. "You were liaison officer." She adjusted his pillow, though it didn't need adjusting. A gesture of care. A marker for the invisible cameras that didn't exist, for the documentation of her tender care if anyone ever reviewed the tapes. The thing about Sanjin was the dust. Red dust. Tasted like copper and diesel and fear. Everything tasted like that. She didn't expect response. Comas didn't yield to monologue therapy, that was pseudoscience, the kind of thing families clung to before acceptance arrived. But Captain Megan O'Brien wasn't a nurse talking to a comatose patient. She was an officer debriefing a wounded soldier, keeping him anchored to a world that was still out there, still waiting, still breathing his name into the darkness. The next night, she brought the radio. Megan had acquired it through methods she wouldn't write anywhere, a $340 used unit from a surplus electronics dealer in Decatur, purchased with cash and signed for with a name that didn't belong to her. She kept it in her locker wrapped in a gym towel that bore the insignia of a Coast Guard station in San Diego. No one asked questions. Nurses kept strange hours and stranger coping mechanisms. She positioned the speaker near Hayes's pillow, the volume set low enough that it sounded like ambient hospital noise if anyone was listening. The frequency was 2,638 kHz, the Coast Guard Maritime Safety Information Broadcast. She'd memorized the schedule, weather reports at 1/2 every hour, radio checks from active vessels, the clipped professional exchanges of people doing dangerous work in unforgiving water. It was the sound of his tribe. The sound of home for a man who'd never be going home the conventional way. "Cutter Cypress, Coast Guard Station Savannah, radio check, how do you copy?" The transmission crackled through the speaker, pristine and urgent. Megan watched Hayes's eyelids. No flicker. No REM sleep, no neurological protest. The doctors had run their tests, gathered their data, delivered their verdicts. The damage to his brainstem was consistent with severe anoxia. The brain had largely shut down to preserve core functions. Higher cognition was unlikely ever to return. He was breathing on his own, that was something, but the consciousness that had made him Hayes, that had trained him, that had made him capable of the decisions he'd made in the Helmand, was gone. Probably. Almost certainly. Probably wasn't the same as certainly. "Station Savannah, Cutter Cypress, loud and clear, we are standing by." Another voice. Another vessel. Another person doing the work. Megan sat with him through the night, rotating through frequencies, letting the voices of the Coast Guard wash over both of them. She didn't speak during the broadcasts. She just watched his monitors and listened and waited for something that wasn't coming, or was coming so slowly it couldn't be measured in hours or shifts or even months. The ticking of the clock was the loudest sound in the room, the unseen countdown to the moment when Pierce would complete what he'd started. On the 4th night of her unauthorized protocol, she placed the flag. It was a small thing, folded in the Navy fashion, a triangle of faded cloth that had belonged to Petty Officer Marcus Webb. Webb had been 7 years younger than Hayes, from a town outside Asheville that most people had never heard of, with a mother who still sent care packages to the unit even though the unit had scattered to the 4 corners. Webb had been standing too close to an IED trigger, or too far from cover, or unlucky on a Tuesday when luck had run out. The flag had made it home. The flag had made it to Cedar Creek Medical. And now, by his sister's instructions and with Hayes's daughter's written permission, the flag sat on his bedside table where he might see it if the seeing ever came back. Megan positioned it carefully, not so visible that it would raise questions from the day staff, but visible enough that if Hayes's eyes opened and registered anything, that triangle of cloth would be the first thing his mind tried to recognize. Something from before. Something that meant something. She pressed her palm flat against it for just a moment. Then she stepped back. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical had the aesthetic of a space where bad news was delivered with administrative efficiency: pale blue walls, a table made of particle board disguised as walnut, fluorescent lights that hummed a frequency just below consciousness. Dr. Pierce sat at the head of the table like a conductor preparing for an unwelcome performance. Beside him, Sandra Chen shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her nurse manager badge reflecting the overhead lights. She wouldn't meet Megan's eyes. Pierce opened a folder. The folder was thick. 17 instances of excessive charting, he said, reading without effect. Times logged as patient care that appeared to be personal journaling. Here. Here. And here. He slid pages across the table. Each one bore Megan's login ID, timestamps from the night shift, notes that had been carefully extracted from context and presented as evidence of malfeasance. Megan read the first page. The charting was hers. The timestamps were correct. The words had been written in the context of Hayes's neurological assessment, his response to stimuli, the careful cataloguing of any micro-changes in his baseline that might indicate emerging consciousness. Out of context, it looked like devotional writing. Obsessive. Inappropriate. 9 cases of unauthorized patient interaction beyond standard nursing scope, Pierce continued. Speaking to comatose patients is not evidence-based care. Playing audio for therapeutic purposes requires physician authorization and documented clinical rationale. You have neither. The Coast Guard radio, Sandra started. Is precisely the problem, Pierce cut her off. He didn't look at her. His attention remained fixed on Megan, waiting for the flinch, for the tremor of fear, for the moment when she would crack and apologize and beg to keep the job. It's not part of his standard protocol. It violates the principle of physician-directed care. This is Cedar Creek Medical, not a community center. Megan turned the pages. The documentation was surgical in its precision, each notation carefully dated, each deviation from protocol clearly flagged with the relevant hospital regulation number. He'd been building this for weeks. Maybe longer. The paper trail wasn't accidental. It was construction. Architecture. The blueprint of her professional execution. For instances of inefficient time management, Pierce was saying, his voice smooth as hydraulic oil. Extended periods in the patient's room without documented clinical purpose. One evening you spent 23 minutes in room 347 without initiating any procedures or assessments. That was the night she'd just sat with Hayes. No monitors adjusted. No medications administered. No documentation of clinical purpose because the purpose couldn't be documented. She had been keeping him company. She had been reminding him that someone was still here, that he hadn't been forgotten, that the world outside his closed eyes still had his name in it. Nurse O'Brien, Pierce said, and now he did meet her eyes, expecting capitulation. You're being placed on a performance improvement plan effective immediately. This folder contains the details. You'll have 30 days to bring your practices into alignment with hospital protocol. Any further deviations will result in immediate termination. Do you understand? Megan's jaw clenched. Once. A small betrayal of the discipline it took not to move, not to speak, not to let the rage that had nowhere to go find its way into her face. She understood perfectly. She understood that Pierce wasn't motivated by protocol compliance. She understood that this wasn't about charting standards. She understood that her presence in room 347 had become an obstacle to something he was protecting, something worth making a nurse's career burn down to protect. She picked up the pen from the table and signed the document. Her signature was steady. Her hands were steady. Everything about her was steady because to move in any other way would be to confirm everything Pierce was counting on, that she was just a nurse, just someone with a job to lose, just someone who could be frightened into compliance. No, she said when he asked if she had anything to say. Nothing. She stood and walked out of the conference room, and if her steps were slightly too measured, slightly too controlled, if her breathing was slightly too practiced, no one noticed. The hallway was empty. The afternoon shift was in transition. She had exactly 4 hours before her reassignment took effect. The notice came through the hospital system at 5 o'clock. Effective immediately, Nurse Captain Megan O'Brien would be assigned to the Surgical Recovery Unit, 7 beds, high acuity, 0 comatose patients with classified case histories. The assignment was not negotiable. The assignment was not subject to appeal. The assignment was Dr. Pierce's way of saying, "You are no longer allowed to touch what I'm protecting." Sandra found her in the locker room. "I'm sorry," Sandra said, and she sounded like she meant it. He went to administration directly. "I tried to push back on the charting allegations, said your patient outcomes are excellent, but he said outcomes were his purview, not nursing's." He used the phrase insubordination by proxy. "I've never heard that before." Megan didn't respond. She was changing into street clothes, pulling off the scrubs that had been her armor and her disguise and her way into Cedar Creek Medical. The locker metal was cold against her fingertips. Everything was cold. "Are you going to file a formal complaint?" Sandra asked. "Because I'll support you. The charting thing doesn't hold up." "No," Megan said. The word came out flat. Professional. The voice of someone who understood the rules and was accepting defeat within them. But that wasn't the last thing she did that night. She walked to room 347 on the way out, moving through corridors she'd memorized weeks ago, and found a younger nurse, one of the float pool staff, doing vitals checks with all the engaged interest of someone checking items off a clipboard. The nurse glanced up when Megan entered. Her name tag said Jennifer. She looked tired. "I'll take this one," Megan said quietly. Dr. Pierce approved the swap. Jennifer's shoulders relaxed with visible relief. "Thank God. I've got 4 other rooms and, yeah. Thanks." She left before Megan could change her mind. The door closed softly behind her. Megan stood alone with Commander Hayes for the first time since the performance review, and her hands trembled at her sides. Not from fear. From the burning clarity of having just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, from having committed to the mission so completely that her career was now a variable she could no longer control. She had come to Cedar Creek Medical with a cover and a purpose and a 2-year timeline. She had 3 weeks left before Pierce completed her termination, and she'd just made sure those 3 weeks would be spent violating every protocol he'd documented. She pulled the chair close to his bed. "I'm done being cautious," she said quietly, her voice dropping an octave, shedding the deferential tone she'd cultivated with Sandra and the day staff. "You were my commander once, and I followed you into the Helmand province, and I watched people die who were better than I was. I came here to understand why you're still alive when they're not. I came here to get you back." She leaned forward. "So we're going to do this differently now. You're going to listen to what I tell you, and your body's going to listen, and if Pierce fires me tomorrow, at least you'll wake up knowing someone was still fighting." The monitors beeped their mechanical indifference. Hayes's eyes remained closed. But Megan's hands had stopped trembling. The mask had slipped enough that she could see what was underneath it, not a nurse, not anyone, but the thing that had survived the Helmand province and learned to walk in a skin that fit well enough to fool everyone. She played the Coast Guard radio until sunrise. She talked through the night about operations that were classified, about men who were gone, about the small terrible fact that Hayes was one of the few who had made it this far and might not be gone at all. And when the day shift arrived, she left no note, no explanation, just the folded flag on the bedside table and a radio tuned to the frequency of a voice that sounded like home. The ventilator alarm screamed at 0300 hours. A single, piercing wail that cut through the dark of the Cedar Creek Medical night shift like a combat alert. Megan was at Commander Hayes' bedside in 4 seconds. The machine didn't panic. It just reported facts. And the facts were killing him. Oxygen saturation, 92%. Falling. She pulled back the blanket and exposed his chest. The left side wasn't moving. Not a flutter, not a ripple. Just stillness where there should have been breath. His trachea had deviated right, pushed by something invisible and fatal. His neck veins were distended like rope pulled taut. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, no way out, collapsing the lung with every heartbeat, shifting his mediastinum, crushing his heart from the inside. Oxygen sat, 88%. Dropping. The code button. Her hand hit it without thinking. The crash cart rolled toward her across the tile, but she already knew the math. For minutes until the code team arrived. Commander Hayes had less than 2. She grabbed the needle decompression kit from the supply cabinet. Her hands moved with muscle memory older than her nursing license. Older than Cedar Creek. Older than the decade since Helmand Province. This was beyond her scope. This was physician territory. This would end her career in a way that made Dr. Pierce's documentation trail look like gentle suggestions. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks on Hayes's chest, the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The exact spot where was building pressure like a bomb. She prepped the skin with antiseptic. The smell of it, sharp, medicinal, cold, was the same as it had been in a field hospital 8,000 miles away. Some smells don't change. Some muscle memory doesn't fade. Oxygen sat, 84%. The monitor was beeping in short, anxious bursts now. The needle went in. 14 gauge. The plastic catheter over the steel. She felt the subtle resistance of the chest wall, then the sudden give as she breached the pleural space. And then it came, or the hiss. The unmistakable sound of air escaping under pressure, a small terrible whisper that meant she'd done it right or done it fatally wrong. There was no middle ground with a needle in someone's chest. She secured the catheter, kept pressure on the entry site, and waited. The monitor didn't lie. Commander Hayes's oxygen saturation stopped falling. 84%. Held. Then climbed. 86%. 89%. 92%. His chest began moving again, symmetrically, both sides rising and falling like a man remembering how to breathe. The code team arrived 30 seconds later to find her standing there calm, her other hand monitoring his pulse, her composure like armor. She reported the findings in the voice of someone ordering coffee. Tension pneumothorax. Decompressed. Patient stable. The respiratory therapist stared. You did a needle decompression. He was dying, Megan said simply. By morning, Dr. Pierce had filed the paperwork. She found the official notification posted on the unit bulletin board at 0700, her hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic and fear. The document was printed in hospital letterhead with her name spelled correctly. Termination. Effective immediately. Practicing medicine without a license. Violation of scope of practice. Practicing beyond physician authorization. Each phrase was precise, professional, and would be discovered by any licensing board that ever tried to hire her again. Dr. Pierce appeared in the unit at 0715, flanked by 2 security guards whose uniforms made it clear this wasn't negotiable. His smile was the smile of a man who had finally moved his chess piece into winning position. Nurse O'Brien. You're terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal items and then to your vehicle. Sandra materialized from the medication room, her face hardening. Wait, what? You can't just. I can, and I have, Pierce said smoothly. Hospital policy permits immediate termination for practicing outside scope of licensure. It's a patient safety matter. He looked at Megan with something that might have been satisfaction. You wanted to be a hero. Now you get to be unemployed. The other nurses gathered at the station, murmuring. Megan could see the calculation happening in their eyes: stay quiet and keep your job, or speak up and join her on the termination list. She didn't blame them. She wouldn't have blamed them either. This was how systems worked. This was how people like Pierce survived. She removed her badge from her pocket and set it on the desk. The plastic casing was worn smooth from 6 weeks of pressing it against her scrubs. Her name and title, reduced to a hospital property item to be returned and reassigned to someone more compliant. You saved no one, Pierce said as she walked toward the security guards. You violated every protocol that exists for good reason. You're done. Megan didn't respond. The woman who had extracted 12 Marines under fire didn't argue with administrators. The woman who had held 7 lives together in a field hospital didn't defend herself to a man billing Medicare for services never rendered. She just walked. Between the security guards, past the station where Hayes lay sleeping in his bed, past the folded flag she'd left on his nightstand knowing she wouldn't be there to see what came next. The drive home was on autopilot. Traffic on I-75 was light for midday. The radio played something forgettable. She parked in the driveway at noon on a Tuesday and sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes without moving, her hands still at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel like they were in a simulator and the simulation would end if she let go. It didn't end. She walked inside and sat at the kitchen table in scrubs that smelled like chlorhexidine and failure. The house was quiet. Her son wouldn't be home from school for another 4 hours. She had 4 hours to figure out how to explain that she'd failed. Not at nursing. Not at Cedar Creek. She'd failed at the mission. She'd failed at waking him up. She'd gotten herself terminated before she could finish what she'd started, and now there would be no one monitoring Commander Hayes, no one documenting Pierce's practices, no one positioned to help when the next opportunity came. When her son walked through the back door at 3:48 p.m. and found her sitting at the table, her face wet with tears she couldn't seem to stop, he dropped his backpack on the floor and stared. "Mom? What happened? Why are you home?" She looked at him, this man-shaped creature who still had his father's eyes, and realized she couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't explain that she'd been embedded in a hospital on a classified assignment. Couldn't explain why monitoring a comatose Coast Guard officer mattered more than defending her professional reputation. Couldn't tell him that sometimes the mission required you to burn your own life down and keep walking forward anyway. "I lost my job, sweetheart," she said. He came around the table and sat beside her. "What did you do?" "I saved someone's life," she whispered. He didn't ask what happened next. He just sat there in the quiet house, this teenager who still believed his mother was invincible, and that was almost worse than the termination itself, the knowledge that she'd let him see her break, that she'd failed to maintain the armor. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, a letter arrived on official Pentagon stationery addressed to Captain Megan O'Brien. The hospital administrator had called requesting her immediate presence at an emergency board hearing. She arrived in civilian clothes, jeans, a gray sweater, boots that had seen Helmand Province and never quite left it. The executive conference room was full. Dr. Pierce was there with his presentation materials spread across the table, ready to explain how she'd violated policy, endangered patients, and violated the fundamental trust of the medical profession. He had no idea what was about to walk through the door. The administrator glanced at the clock. "We're ready to begin. Captain O'Brien, we need to discuss the incident of." Megan's son entered carrying something. A shadow box with glass front and military-grade backing. Her hands went very still. She hadn't authorized this. She hadn't told him where to find it. "I'm sorry, this is a closed hearing," the administrator said. "Mom," her son interrupted, looking only at her. "They need to see these." He set the shadow box on the table. Under the glass, a silver star, a purple heart, 2 bronze stars, the small colored ribbons of a service record that spanned 3 continents and 2 decades. And a nameplate reading Captain Megan O'Brien, USMC. Dr. Pierce leaned forward, his expression already shifting to dismissal. "This is completely irrelevant to the matter at." The conference room door opened. A nurse wheeled Commander Hayes in. Awake. Thin. His eyes clear and focused on Megan's face. His voice was hoarse from 5 years of silence, but unmistakable. "Valkyrie." The room went dead silent. 2 days later, the hospital administrator's office had the kind of silence that comes before collapse. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead like dying insects. Megan sat in a metal chair, her hands folded, her face composed, the mask still firmly in place even though everyone in this room now knew exactly who she was. Dr. Pierce stood near the door, his attorney beside him, both men radiating the false confidence of people who still believed institutional power could protect them from evidence. Then the doors opened. Her son walked in carrying a shadow box. 17 years old, ramrod straight, uniform pressed sharp enough to cut. Behind him came the general, 2 stars on his collar, Pentagon credentials clipped to his jacket, and the bearing of someone accustomed to rooms bending to his will the moment he entered. A Marine Corps liaison followed. Then a woman in a Navy blazer carrying 3 cardboard boxes filled with billing records. Federal agents. Not hospital security. Federal. The general didn't speak. He simply looked at Megan, then at the shadow box her son was opening on the administrator's desk. Under the fluorescent lights, 2 medals caught fire. The Silver Star first. Then the Purple Heart. And beside it, another Purple Heart. The glass gleamed. The ribbons held their colors perfectly despite 5 years in a box in a teenager's closet. "Mom, they need to see these," her son said quietly. His voice didn't shake. Megan's composure didn't crack. Didn't even bend. She simply nodded once, as if a teenage boy had just handed her a coffee report instead of publicly unmasking a career that had existed in shadows. Dr. Pierce's face went white. His attorney's hand moved toward his arm, a restraining gesture that came far too late. From the hospital bed in the recovery wing 3 floors below, Commander Hayes had already whispered it. Awake for the first time in 5 years. Awake because a needle decompression at 0300 hours had released a pressure pocket the size of a fist from his left lung, and because Megan had done it with hands steady as surgical lasers while his oxygen saturation climbed from 68 to 94 in 40 seconds. His first word wasn't his sister's name or his daughter's name. It was hers. Valkyrie. The call sign. The code. The name the Coast Guard had given her in Helmand Province when she'd extracted 12 wounded under fire, moving through crossfire like something made of purpose instead of flesh. The general had walked into that recovery room moments after Hayes whispered it, and Hayes had told him everything, about the flag on his bedside table, about the voice reading him radio chatter through the darkness, about the woman who'd kept him tethered to life when his own brain couldn't. Now the Marine Corps liaison stepped forward and opened a leather folder. "Captain Megan O'Brien citation," he began, and the room seemed to compress around the words. "For extraordinary heroism in combat operations, Helmand Province, June 15, 2009. Under sustained enemy fire, Captain O'Brien coordinated the extraction of 12 wounded personnel from a compromised forward operating base. Moving through active combat zones, she provided emergency stabilization, navigated 3 separate ambush positions, and delivered all personnel to medical evacuation helicopter with 0 loss of life. Her actions demonstrated valor above and beyond." "This is irrelevant," Dr. Pierce interrupted. His voice cracked on the second word. "Whatever her military record, hospital protocol violations." The general held up one hand. Not aggressively. Just held it up. Pierce's attorney actually pulled him backward. "Dr. Marcus Pierce," the general said, and his voice was the sound of institutional power that didn't need to raise itself. "Captain O'Brien has been on official assignment from the Pentagon for 8 months. Her assignment was to investigate suspicious mortality patterns in this hospital's long-term care unit. Her investigation has uncovered systematic Medicare fraud totaling approximately $470,000. He nodded to the woman in the navy blazer. She opened the first box. Billing records. Photocopy after photocopy. Specialist consultations that never happened. Patient names that never saw the doctors whose names appeared on the forms. Signatures that didn't match. Commander Hayes was billed for 47 specialist consultations he never received, the general continued. Neurology consults. Cardiology consultations. Psychiatric evaluations. None of them happened. The physicians whose names appear on the documentation have confirmed they never evaluated Mr. Hayes, never entered his room, never billed these procedures. You did. Your signature on 47 fraudulent consultation orders. Your names on billing forms submitted to Medicare. Your scheme, Doctor. Pierce's face had moved beyond white into something the color of old bone. 2 additional comatose patients in your care followed the same pattern, the general said. Mrs. Patricia Harding, admitted 6 years ago with a severe stroke. Billed for 32 specialist consultations. Mr. Robert Martinez, 5 years post-traumatic brain injury. Billed for 51 consultations. Both patients heavily sedated. Both unable to communicate. Both unable to report that these consultations never occurred. Both profitable to keep in exactly that condition, wouldn't you say? The second cardboard box opened. Internal emails. Text messages. Audio recordings from Megan's phone, her documenting conversations with billing staff, with nurses, with the neurologist who'd finally admitted on tape that he'd never seen Commander Hayes but had signed the consultation forms because Pierce had assured him they were routine updates. Captain O'Brien's investigation also revealed that you systematically withheld physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy protocols from your comatose patients, the general continued. These are standard rehabilitative procedures designed to prevent deterioration and maintain potential for recovery. You withheld them. Because recovery patients require less billing, less specialist consultation, less justification for continued hospitalization. But comatose patients? They can remain profitable indefinitely. The general turned to face Pierce directly. Commander Hayes was scheduled for speech therapy protocol in month 3 of his hospitalization. You cancelled it. Cancelled it repeatedly. A routine needle decompression, a procedure that any competent physician should have anticipated as possible in his condition, became his first step toward recovery because Captain O'Brien performed it without your authorization. Now he's awake. Now he can testify. Now his recovery makes your fraud public and undeniable. Pierce's attorney was already moving toward the door, his hand on his client's shoulder. We're filing a motion to dismiss these allegations on the grounds that federal agents executed a warrant on your office 1 hour ago, the woman in the navy blazer said. She'd produced her FBI credentials without fanfare, just facts delivered like medication. We have your personal bank records showing deposits totaling $230,000 beyond your hospital salary. We have communications with a medical billing consultant in Miami who processed your false claims. We have 3 radiologists, 2 cardiologists, and 1 neurologist who will testify they signed consultation forms without performing evaluations. Pierce tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The silence that followed was so thick you could operate in it. The hospital administrator stood up. Dr. Pierce, your employment at Cedar Creek Medical is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. Your medical license is suspended pending investigation. You will have no further contact with patients or staff. All your privileges are revoked. It took 90 seconds. 90 seconds for a career to collapse. Pierce's attorney led him toward the door, moving fast now, knowing what came next. Federal charges. Arraignment. The slow institutional machinery of justice grinding forward. The general waited until the door closed. Then he turned to Megan, came to attention, and rendered a salute. A full military salute, his hand to his temple, his face composed with the respect of one warrior honoring another. Megan stood and returned it. Welcome back to the command, Captain, he said quietly. Her son was crying. Just standing there in his new dress uniform, tears running down his face, watching his mother be recognized as something other than the nurse who'd been humiliated in hospital corridors. The administrator extended his hand. Megan shook it. No apologies were offered. They weren't necessary. By evening, the Atlanta News was running the story. Local doctor under investigation for Medicare fraud. Federal agents raid Cedar Creek Medical. Patient exploitation scheme affecting comatose individuals. Pierce's official hospital photo, confident, smiling, the expression of a man who'd believed power was permanent, appeared on every screen in the city, attached to words like kickbacks and falsification and felony. By morning, his medical license was suspended. By afternoon, his attorney had negotiated a plea deal. Felony fraud. Restitution. Forfeiture. Prison time. 6 months later, Megan heard through Sandra that Pierce was teaching CPR basics at a community college for $15 an hour. The kind of remedial class that nursing students took in their first semester. The man who'd controlled physicians now taught teenagers chest compressions. The man who'd condescended about community colleges now depended on one for survival. Megan felt no satisfaction, only the hollow recognition that some people destroyed themselves more thoroughly than any enemy could. But that wasn't why she stood in Commander Hayes' room on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 months after the hearing. She stood there because Hayes was pinning her son's Coast Guard ensign bars on his dress uniform, and Jennifer was crying, and the administrator was present along with Sandra and several nurses who'd finally understood what they'd witnessed when Megan endured Pierce's humiliation. They understood now that they'd been watching a captain hold her composure under fire from an opponent who'd never seen real fire in his life. Hayes' hands were thin but steady as he fastened the bars. "These represent service and sacrifice," he said, his voice still slightly hoarse from 5 years of disuse. "Your mother understands both better than most." He stepped back. Megan's son saluted. Hayes returned it, precision and respect flowing between them like water finding its level. After the ceremony, Hayes took the folded flag from his bedside table, the one that had sat there for 5 years, the one that belonged to Petty Officer Chen, who died pulling him from the vehicle in Helmand Province, who'd bled out in the dust while Hayes couldn't remember his own name. "This belonged to Chen," Hayes said quietly. "He died so I could live. I couldn't tell his family what happened because I couldn't remember, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything. You gave me the chance to return this with the story they deserved." He held it out to Megan. She took it, and for the first time since she'd walked into Cedar Creek Medical with a nurse's credential and a secret, her composure cracked. Not a collapse. Just the smallest crack, enough for something true to show through. A smile. Real and unguarded and belonging entirely to the moment. Her son touched her shoulder. Outside, Atlanta stretched under October sun. Somewhere in the city, Dr. Pierce was teaching a classroom of teenagers chest compressions for minimum wage, his name erased from the hospital's donor wall, his marriage dissolved, his career a footnote in federal court documents. But in this room, Commander Hayes held his sister close. Jennifer wiped tears. Sandra handed Megan a coffee mug that read Valkyrie across its front. From the night shift, Sandra said, "We wanted you to know we're sorry. We didn't understand." Megan held the mug. Held the flag. Stood in the light coming through the window, and finally allowed herself to be seen. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, like this video and subscribe. Let me know in the comments, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong?